thank you, David, for hosting me. Thank you all for coming out. This will probably be a very unusual talk that have never maybe even heard the things that we'll talk about tonight. This will, for many of you, will be brand new information. And thank you for those of you who support David's work at the Iona Institute. I mean, that support allows him to do the important work that he does here on the ground, but also to work with people like me. So anyway, so welcome. So I by training, I am a nurse. I spent about 20 years working in nursing. Mostly I did pediatric critical care nursing, so I have a very deep interest and passion for children who are front and center of this huge debate. How do we make children? How do we get children? Who has a right to a child? All those kind of terms. Then I went back to graduate school to study bioethics. I was really concerned as a nurse working day in and day out in the hospital with the cutting edge technology that was forcing us to always be dealing with a new ethical dilemma. In my field of pediatrics, it was, when is a child viable? Because we kept having babies born younger and younger and younger and smaller and smaller and smaller. I worked with the doctor at UC, the University of California, San Francisco, who did the first fetal surgery. So for the first time, we actually removed a baby before it was due to be born, took it outside of the mother's womb, performed surgery, and put the baby back in the uterus to allow it to come to term and then to be born as a healthy child, who otherwise would have been delivered and had some serious health consequences. So these kind of cutting edge technologies just keep coming faster and faster and faster with very little ethical reflection. We just assume it's a new technology, it must be good. And we just accept it uncritically without, twisting it around and looking at it and saying, is this really good? Or is this a line that we shouldn't cross? I sort of fell into the whole area of assisted reproductive technology because I am from the San Francisco Bay Area. It's been about 12, 13 years ago now that we had our huge statewide battle around human cloning research and embryonic stem cell research. And that was when George W. Bush was in the White House and there was all this controversy. We had all our Hollywood celebrities parading around saying, we have to cure sick people. And we have all these hundreds of thousands of surplus human embryos that have been created through assisted reproductive technology. And I started really digging around and sort of trying to understand how was it that we came to have so many human embryos that were now the front and center of this huge public debate. Cures for California was the slogan that was, we always have these very hopeful campaign slogans. And through my research, I sort of landed on the human egg and who is the giver and supplier of the human egg. Because without the egg and sperm, but without the egg, you cannot create a human embryo. So far, until technology changes, that's sort of the beginning. And this human egg is so incredibly valuable. All over the United States, young women on college campuses can make $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 and higher selling their eggs if they're the right kind of girl, smart, pretty, talented, whatever. And in my writing and my research, I had women contacting me because they finally found somebody who was being critical, and they wanted to tell me their story of how they were harmed, seriously harmed, because of their decision to sell their eggs or donate their eggs, as they're told they're donating it, but they're not. And so through that, I made the film Exploitation that David mentioned. And as soon as Exploitation came out, and I continue almost on a weekly basis to hear from women who have done this and have been harmed health-wise. But through the release of that film, we also started hearing from the anonymous donor-conceived people who said, hey, tell our story. We're out there trying to find our biological father, our sperm donor dad, or whatever. And so we produced Anonymous Father's Day. And of course, to complete the trilogy, this whole field is called third-party conception, where you use a third party in order to have a baby. You use an egg donor and or a sperm donor and or a rented, loaned out, borrowed uterus. We had to tell the story of surrogacy. And we're I don't know, I'm sorry, sometimes things don't translate from countries to countries and cultures to cultures, but in the United States, people don't read anymore. They watch movies, they watch videos. And we decided that the best, most compelling way to reach people and educate people was to tell stories through filmmaking. And we continue to do that. So that's just a little bit about me and how I got into this. And if I hit the right button, there we go. So so we talk about the ethics of all this, and what are the cultural and ethical implications? What are the legislative implications? This is a global problem. David mentioned, sperm coming from Denmark, eggs coming from Cyprus, uteruses coming from, India, or name your, most favorite third world country where you can get this on the cheap. So what are the policy implications? Not just education, but also how do we affect and advance good public policy? So just to give you a really 101 intro course to reproductive technology. AI in this context is not artificial intelligence, but AI is artificial insemination. That's what we call low tech. Think turkey basters and cups. It's been around for hundreds of years. We learned all this from the good old veterinarian doctors on the farms who were inseminating cows and pigs and doing all that with livestock. But it's artificial insemination, low tech, has been around for a long time. When I was a staff nurse at UC San Francisco, the University of California, San Francisco, it was not uncommon for some of the single nurses I worked with to get sperm from a willing male nurse and go home with a syringe and a cup and artificially inseminate themselves in their own home. It's that low tech. You can Google Starbucks and sperm donation, and in the United States, there's been quite a few stories written on how you put the ad on Craigslist. We have this thing called Craigslist. I don't know if there's an equivalent in Ireland where you can just sell stuff and advertise a job. I'm looking for a sperm donor. I'm wanting to be a sperm donor. And they literally go into a Starbucks coffee house. The man goes in the men's room, pretty soon the gender-neutral bathroom. He goes there, he donates his sperm, he produces a specimen, he comes out, he hands it to the woman who then goes into the female bathroom at Starbucks. Literally, that's how crude, but how low-tech it is. IVF, in vitro fertilization, literally means in class, think test, we used to call test tube babies, has been around since 1978. The United Kingdom here, Louise Brown was born. The world awoke, the headlines were all over the world, the papers, the first test tube baby has been born. And that really was a watershed moment. Because before, you can imagine or not imagine, it's really easy to get sperm out of a man's body. But it's very difficult to get eggs out of a woman's body. And even though Louise Brown was finally born, there was years and years and decades of research and trial and error and attempts and failures before Louise Brown was finally born. Because it's tiny little eggs that have to get out of a body. Then you have to make the embryos in the lab, tiny little embryos. Then you have to get those embryos back into the womb. They have to implant. And the whole process of the baby being, formed in the mother's womb, it takes off. And so it was so important at that moment because they finally figured it out. And they got Louise Brown, who by all accounts is a very healthy now young woman who's now gone on to have her own children. Make no mistake, though, all assisted reproductive technology is pretty much eugenic in origin. I talked about, we have catalogs of donors. We want pretty girls that speak French and play the violin. We want studly, handsome, athletic men. The goal is not just to get a baby, but the goal is to get a healthy, cute, perfect, fill in the blank, whatever kind of baby you want. And that's... What's significant with this slide is that 5 years after Louise Brown was born, we had the first medical documentation of a baby being born with donor eggs. So we finally, Mr. Brown and Mrs. Brown used Mrs. Brown's eggs, Mr. Brown's sperm, Mrs. Brown's uterus, and Louise Brown was born. But just 5 years later, we have the first baby born down in Australia, born through donor eggs. And the doctor who actually did that and published it in the medical research is pictured here, Dr. Alan Trounsend, who was then brought from Australia to California, my state, to run our embryonic stem cell human cloning initiative that was passed and funded by taxpayer dollars. Many fertility doctors have shifted from fertility work to embryo and cloning work. Why? They're experts at making embryos in the lab. They've been doing it in the fertility clinics for many, many years. Townsend has actually since left, and he's back down in Australia, but he was in California for many years running that. We like to say that this is all the deconstructing of our reproductive bodies. The birth control pill allowed us to have sex without making babies, and now we have reproductive technology that allows us to make babies without even having sex. Elton John and his partner David Furnish came to California twice to buy eggs, to rent wombs, to have their children. No sexual act. So children totally created in the laboratory without even having sex. And now it's pretty much an anything goes. You know, once the embryo came out of the womb, it's just an anything go. Octomom. Who knows of Octomom, the woman who gave birth to the eight babies in California? Again, I'm on my apology tour apologizing for my state. We call California the wild, wild west of the reproductive tourist capital of the world. I mean, really, if you have money, you can just about get anything that you want. So here we are sitting in Dublin, Ireland on this beautiful evening. We avoided the rain. And we're staring at, in the face, the new modern family. It's a global, chaotic, unregulated industry. Postmenopausal pregnancies. 30 is the new 40, 40 is the new 50, whatever. We have women who literally are old enough to be grandmothers already through menopause who have given birth through modern technology. I can't remember the oldest woman, but I want to say in her 70s. It was a woman in India recently that she and her husband always wanted a son. And through IVF, egg donation, she gave birth as a very elderly woman. A litter birth, is a woman's body designed to carry 8 babies? Like a puppy? No, of course not. Twiblings and triplings. We have to make up words for these. There was a woman in the New York Times who documented her case of infertility. She didn't want to burden a surrogate carrying a twin pregnancy because a twin pregnancy is high risk, so she hired 2 surrogates. So she created her embryos in the laboratory and then split them up and put some in one womb and the other in the other. So technically, if they would have been born in the same womb, they would have been twins, born at the same time and developed at the same time, but they weren't. So they coined the term twiblings because they were twins / siblings / and then the same with triplings. So selective reduction is rampant. We have 2 very big cases in California right now of surrogate mothers who were carrying triplets, and the intended parents who had hired these women said, we don't want 3 babies, you must reduce down the pregnancy. And the contracts they signed all had language in it that said they had to reduce the pregnancy, that the intended parents could control that. But both of the women balked. They changed their mind. They said, I can't do it because there's nothing wrong. For them, the issue was there was nothing wrong with the babies. They were all healthy. The pregnancies were going along without complication. And they just, in their own moral conscience, could not selectively reduce a healthy pregnancy. And so we had to get them legal counsel and legal help, and neither one of them did, and both of them gave birth to the triplets. And as far as we know, hopefully they're doing well, but once they're surrendered to the intended parents, you don't keep track of what has become of them. Again, the point of eugenics, pre-implantation genetic screening. If we're going to be spending, the average take-home IVF baby is a 6-figure cost. Average, $100,000. So why, and again, I'm saying this, I don't agree with it, but why would you spend $100,000 to get a baby that had fill in the blank, Down syndrome, was the wrong sex, had cystic fibrosis, whatever. So we just screen in the laboratory. I call it search and destroy. There's no treatment. We're not screening the embryos because if we know they're sick, if they have a disease, we can treat it. We're screening them because we know that we can then discard them or give them to the researchers for research. Save your siblings. This was big when I was in pediatric nursing. You have a sick child who needs a genetic match for a bone marrow transplant. We don't do bone marrow transplants now. We do cord blood transplants right now. And so couples will create a bunch of embryos in the laboratory, allow the one that's been tested that's a fit, a match. Think of organ donation. We don't want rejection, so we want to find the match. And then we allow that child to be implanted and be born. And then at birth, we collect the stem cells from the cord blood of the newborn baby so that we can do the transfusion to the sick child. And it works as a therapy. but it raises all kinds of complex ethical problems. What happens to the embryos that got discarded because they weren't the genetic match? What does that mean to the child who knows the only reason they were born was they were needed to be born to save somebody else's life? And that whole, there was a great book, Judy Peacold, who's a very famous American author and film, called My Sister's Keeper, and it really did, I think, a nice job treating that and raising the ethical questions. Growing demographics, single mothers by choice. Mr. Right hasn't come along, all I need is a sperm donor. Single dads by choice, who wants to be tied down to a wife, but I really want to, embrace my fatherhood. I can just hire women to have my babies. Co-parenting. There's a website that's just called co-parenting. People that don't want to be romantically involved, they don't want to get married, but they want to create a child that they share. You get the child on the weekends, I get him at Christmas, you get him, and this whole movement toward this area of parenting, modern family, of just co-parenting, like it's a car. You get it on the weekends, I get it, Monday through Friday. Of course, homosexual parenting, back to, the Elton John story, that, now two men can be dads and be parents. I find the next thing interesting, gamete donation within families, intrafamilial gamete donation, and the ethics of that. The American Society of Reproductive Medicine, which is our professional body in the U.S. that sort of has guidelines on how this practice should occur in the United States, has about a 3-page document. Is it okay for a sister to give her sister her eggs, or to be her surrogate? I got to ask this repeatedly today in the media and all the interviews I did. Well, what if a sister just wants to help her sister? Is that okay? What if a mother wants to help her daughter, or daughter wants to help her girlfriend? What if a dad wants to give his sperm to his son who's sterile? And so they really break down the ethics of it based on how close is it to incest, is how they sort of had decided if this is so sister to sister, brother to brother is okay, but father to son, or those are just, they don't pass the smell test as far as an incestual type of relationship. And this the whole area of anonymity. Should we just do this for friends and family, or should it just be strangers on Craigslist hooking up in Starbucks? And what are the ethics around this new way of creating children in the lab? Grandmother surrogacy, that's been huge in the news recently, where literally women are carrying their grandchildren to term because for some reason their daughter has an incompetent uterus or has had problems carrying a pregnancy to term. So you have grandmothers who are in their 50s and 60s that are giving birth to their own grandchildren, which I think is rather kind of odd, to be polite. And the dirtiest little secret of all this is how much fertility medicine still fails. It's been around since the birth of Louise Brown, 1978, and we have one group in the U.S. that does a little bit of tracking and oversight called the Center for Disease Control, and their annual report hasn't moved the needle a bit, and overwhelmingly, almost 75% of all IVF cycles fail. There's so many people that don't get a take-home baby, but you don't see that in the glossy pamphlets. You don't hear about that. You don't hear about any of that. And so, when and if a bill comes to your, before your lawmakers here, at one level, this is a fiscal, I think a fiscal waste of resources. When we have people that really have immediate medical needs, that are dealing with life-threatening illness, even though infertility can be very sad and people grieve, and first comes love, then comes marriage, and then comes a baby carriage, and everybody just assumes you'll be able to have children when you want to have children, and they'll come as you just imagine they will. That isn't the case, and so we have to realize that this is just a big waste of money. So I see you loaded up the clips, but I don't think I'm going to show them. That's okay. I'm just going to pass through them. Well, I'm going to talk a bit. I'm going to go back. So Maggie's story, I don't have that because we didn't produce it in DVD. It's just a short film. It's about 20 minutes, so it's only available online. If you're an Amazon Prime member, you can watch it for free on Amazon Prime. Maggie's an interesting young woman. She is an egg seller times 10. She sold her eggs 10 times. So, roughly, she could have hundreds and hundreds of children out there right now. But what Maggie... her story highlights is that she was never told that this could be risky to her health. And now Maggie is battling stage 4 breast cancer. That has spread to her, her liver and her bones. Maggie, like most egg donors, is screened out for breast cancer. She has no medical history of breast cancer. On her mother's side, father's side. She was BRCA gene tested, which is the genetic test you do to not be at risk for breast cancer. She's a young woman. Breast cancer normally doesn't strike young women. It's more of women in their 40s and 50s that get breast cancer. And so she's become quite an advocate. She lives in Washington State. And so she's been very outspoken in telling her story. And sadly, it's been really hard to get these women, egg donors in particular, any kind of legal representation, and also any kind of legal recourse for the harm that's been done to them. It's been really hard because we don't have any studies in the medical literature that show the link between fertility drugs and cancer in egg donors. We have it for infertile women. There's a lot in the medical literature about fertility drugs and cancer risks and infertility in infertile women, but we've never studied the healthy young woman who's not a patient, who doesn't have an underlying defect. So you can't extrapolate from this research that's been done on a patient population that has a defect and translate it to people like Maggie. And so, Maggie travels with me and speaks to lawmakers and does a great job doing that. So again, we tell real stories of real people. The fertility industry, the people who oppose my work, say, well, that's just anecdotal. Oh, well, of course there's going to be risk. There's risk to everything. We cross the street and we take a risk that we're going to get hit by a car. And I say to them several things that I won't say in public. But no, I say to them, but your case that it's safe is anecdotal. So they like to say there's no risk, there's no harm, they're not exposing themselves, but they don't have any research to back that up. They're just saying it. So when they accuse me of just telling people's stories, I said, well, you're just telling people's stories too. And so until we have the actual scientific research that's been studied on non-patient young women who are doing this, I will continue to tell their stories and to be their voice. These women take very powerful drugs. They take very, very high doses. If you're paying a woman $15,000 or $20,000 for eggs, you don't want one egg. A woman normally, naturally, once a month ovulates one egg, occasionally two, which is how you get twins occurring in nature. These women are aggressively bombarded with these drugs so that they produce 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 eggs. Cindy on the slide, they got 60 eggs from her. I mean, if a woman does one egg a month times 12 months in a year that's 5 years worth of her eggs that, were poached off of her. And then, they have to undergo a very, surgical procedure to remove the eggs. So it's not just the drugs that they're exposed to, but it's also anesthesia and the risks of surgery and bleeding. Calla and Kylie both suffered strokes. It's very common. These women suffer a syndrome called ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. If you can imagine, their ovaries get so big, like the size of grapefruits, and they talk about how they can't button their pants, and they feel like they're 9 months pregnant, and they can feel all this fluid sloshing around inside them. And because there's all this fluid and all this swelling, that's a side effect. A stroke can be caused by all this. Water has to go somewhere. And so, Kylie and Calla both suffered stroke. Calla will never be able to have her own children. So she also lost her own fertility in helping somebody else have a baby. And that's just a little bit of the dirty little secrets for what these women undergo. What you hear in all the slick marketing, the egg donor's an angel, right? She's helping build a family. She's given informed consent. Again, how can you give informed consent if you've never studied something? It's just a light little surgery, and that there's no risk, and you're helping somebody have a baby. That's just what they're telling me. Who could be against that? But the reality is their altruistic intentions are exploited. Informed consent is impossible or meaningless. And because of the money issue, even if you inform women of the risk, a lot of times if there's a greater need for the money, they'll take the risk, they'll roll the dice. Calla says in the film, I rolled the dice. I was willing to take the risk because I needed the money. And it is an invasive surgery, and it does come with all the risks of surgery and general anesthesia. And you're helping somebody have your baby, not a baby. Your eggs, your sperm, make people that look like you. They have half your DNA. So this is the reality of that. We've done lots of polling, and you probably would agree, just based on where you started as far as your knowledge on this topic and where you're moving in by the time the end of the night. So we screen our films all over the world, and we did a lot of polling in the early days at all these screenings. And we would ask people to answer 5 short questions. And it was before, you saw the film. Are you in favor of egg donation? Overwhelmingly, people go, yeah, I'm in favor. It's helping people. How much do you know about it? Not very much, but I think it's a good idea. Then they watch exploitation and they go, whoa, I had no idea. I'm just thinking it's like going to the blood, donating a little pint of blood. It's a little prick of my finger and out the door I go. And they see this and they go, we are so upset and disturbed by this. I can't tell you how many university campuses I've been on screening the film, or faculty, professors who've shown the film in their classrooms. Women faint during the screening of exploitation. The first time it happened, I thought, that's kind of odd. Then the next time it happened, I thought, wow, that's really weird. Then the next time it happened, I went, whoa. And I don't find it's not a graphic movie at all. It's not blood and guts and violent, but just hearing these women's stories and seeing how they were exploited and how they were treated, I think just really hits a nerve with especially the young girls on campuses, because they can relate. That could have been me, or I know somebody who did that. So I think that's what's encouraging. If you can educate your legislators, if you can get to them, if you can educate the public, we don't have to be the bad guys that just want to get in everybody's bedrooms and tell them who can make babies and how you can make babies. We can be the advocates and the defenders of our young women and their fragile fertility, and demand that we don't, advance public policy on the backs of them. There's a competition of eggs. I mentioned how I got into this was through research, an embryonic stem cell and human cloning debate. And so we have 2 markets now that are competing. Go home tonight and Google, if you use the internet, Google World Egg Bank. There's all these groups that are now touting themselves as the World Egg Bank, because they want to just have vats and vats and vats of eggs to service the fertility industry for baby making and to service the scientific community for research purposes. In California, this slide is important for us because our current law in California is women may be paid to sell their eggs to help make a baby. However, it is illegal in California to pay a woman to sell her eggs for scientific research purposes. And we were able to have that little small victory when our stem cell and cloning bill was passed. We were able to get at least language in the bill that said taxpayer funds could not be used to buy eggs. And they didn't fuss and fight about that. They were just happy to get their bill passed and to get $3 billion of taxpayer funds to do their research. But every year they come back and they try to change that law because they say it's not fair, and it's true. It's an inconsistency in the law. In fact, nobody should be able to be paid for their eggs to do anything with. And Governor Jerry Brown, our governor in California, said when he vetoed the bill that not everything in life is for sale, nor should it be. Because we were able to make the appeal to Governor Brown that once you move to these world egg banks and having vats and vats of eggs for the researcher, then you're really going to be targeting low-income and impoverished women. Because a researcher doesn't care if you're an Ivy League pretty girl from Yale or Harvard or whatever your prestigious school is here in Ireland. The researcher just needs eggs for just basic bench research. And what I've already seen from my colleagues who work in Africa, we're now poaching eggs from girls as young as 11 and 12 and paying them about the equivalent of $10 US. Because they're these young girls in Africa that nobody wants their eggs to make babies for, but the researchers will be happy to get their hands on their eggs. So I don't know how much you see the advertisements here. They're all over our college newspapers. They're all over Facebook, all of our Craigslist kind of places. But you can see the eugenic element, genius egg donor. No stupid egg donors for us, thank you. A genius egg donor, $35,000 compensation. And then the flowery helping language, help another woman get pregnant. What could be wrong with that? Women helping women, kumbaya, we're all here helping each other. Isn't this lovely? So I'm going to transition now into Anonymous Father's Day, that film, and our work in that space. Like I said, once exploitation came out, all these donor-conceived people came out of the woodwork and said, "Tell our story, please." And the scandal here, if any of you are aware of this, is just how many children perhaps might be born through one donor. You know, David talked about, you know, all the Irish people are using the Danish people, and the Vikings are now coming because we don't track. And this is a global problem. It is so easy to ship egg and sperm and embryos all around the world. It happens all the time. Over 70% of the world global market in sperm is controlled by the U.S. It's not all coming from the U.S., but it's controlled by companies that are based in the U.S. and profiting from it. So even though, you know, the Danish are giving their sperm down here, my hunch is it's probably being brokered through, there's 4 primary sperm clinics, sperm banks in the U.S. that control this 70% plus market, one of them being California Cryobank, again in my state. There's no tracking, there's no sense of how, if and when these children do want to search and find out, how would you find out if you're, you know, a little child or young person in Ireland and your sperm came from Denmark or your eggs came from the U.S.? You know, how would you track down your biological parents if you so desired to meet that person? So in Anonymous Father's Day, again, we'll tell stories, and you'll hear from the people that are agitating, and they're all thankful to be alive. They're grateful for their lives. They're not sad that they were born. They're not, "I wish I'd never been born," but "I wish I hadn't been created this way." So they're objecting to the method of their creation. And I love Barry in the film. When Barry's a great storyteller. He lives up in the Toronto, Canada area. And he is interesting because he's probably one of the older, very outspoken critics of anonymous donor conception, because he calls him his bio-dad. His bio-dad was married to a female fertility doctor in England, and for 3 decades, his bio-dad was his wife's, the doctor's, star donor. So if you can imagine for 30 years being the donor supplying your sperm to your wife's busy fertility practice. So he estimates in Anonymous Father's Day, he says he estimates he's got about 1,000 half-siblings. And slowly he's found, I think the last I chatted with him, 12 or 13 he's found through DNA testing, and people put their, you know, their DNA out there on all the little websites where they track all that. David, I think you know Alana. Do you know Alana? Yeah. So Alana is a dear, sweet young woman. She found out her story when she was young. Her parents were unable to conceive. They adopted a little girl from Korea. So when Alana's mother finally talked her then husband into allowing her to use a sperm donor, Alana grew up saying, "Well, I don't look like my sister." So early on, she was told her story. Of why she had a sister that looked Korean and why she's, you know, blonde and blue-eyed. Unlike Stephanie here on the slide, Stephanie was a mother married with 5 children, and her dad was really, really sick. And she's in the car with her mom saying, "Gosh, I'm really worried about Dad. I hope I don't get what he has. I've got these 5 children I've got to raise." And her mother literally says to her, she's 33 years old at the time, "We never told you this, but your father's not your father. We used a sperm donor." I mean, just talk about a bombshell that's dropped on you when you're worried about your father's health and all that, and then oh, by the way, we've never told you. So it's interesting how in this film we tell the story of how they all found out. They find out in different ways. How a lot of times they already knew it. It's similar to maybe the early adoption days when we did all private adoptions and sealed records and closed. Once children, if they weren't told young, and once they were finally eventually told, you sometimes hear that story, "Well, I knew it all along, and everything I always thought and wondered about was affirmed when I finally found out I was adopted." That's sort of the case. Stephanie talks about this photo, a family photo, that she just looked at all the time. And she just thought, I don't look like these people. I know this is my mom and dad, this is my sister. There's something not right. So when she finally found out at 33, she went, "That picture, no wonder. That's why I didn't think that I looked like them." And and on and on. And you know, Damien and Narl are in Australia, Olivia's up in Canada. Again, the globalness of it. This isn't just a unique problem that's based on a certain particular country, but it affects us all. Australia's had a recent legal victory down in Victoria, Australia. The whole, again, do we do it? How do we do it? Do we do it anonymously? Do we do it open? Does a child have a right to know? Or does the sperm donor have a right to his privacy he's been promised? Because most sperm donors and egg donors oftentimes are promised to have their identity kept anonymous. And they really recently changed the law saying no more of that, no more of that. And what was really significant about the legal victory that they won is it was made retroactive. So it wasn't, you know, sometimes we're just trying, okay, moving forward, can we stop doing this anonymously and have open records and be honest about it? They actually changed the law and said retroactively. So if records have been kept, which oftentimes they haven't been because it's been so many years and they haven't been kept, but if records have been kept, then the child, the young adult, the person has a right to access that information and know about their biological identity. The marketing is still pretty slick. You know, okay, I'll grant you, I say to the young boys when I speak on university campuses, okay, sperm donation, unlike egg donation, is relatively safe. It's not medically harmful. You're not taking drugs. You know, I don't have to be too graphic. You know, it's a harmless way to make money. Of course, sperm donors are paid a lot less than egg donors are because it's not as onerous and taxing and time consuming. And again, you're helping a family out. But the reality is, you know, you're scattering your seed, your sperm, your eggs, whatever out there, and you're creating these children. And, you know, do the children have a right to a father? I know that was part of your big referendum on marriage and making the case that children have a right to a mother and a father. I mean, that was the Declaration on the Rights of the Child. The child has a right to know and to be known by and be raised by their biological parents. But in this, you know, this wild assisted reproductive technology, we've just ripped all these bonds apart and said it doesn't really matter. These people tell me that they live with the real fear of falling in love with somebody that's perhaps related to them. You know, when you have, especially if Ireland's getting so much sperm from, you know, 1 or 2 star donors in Denmark. You know, are we creating a situation where you might accidentally find out that you've fallen in love with your half-brother or your half-sister? We live in an age of genetic medicine. You know, the first thing you are usually asked when you go to a doctor for a physical exam, what's your medical history? You know, what did your mother and father die of? What did your grandparents on, you know, your mother and father's side? What are you at risk for? And 10 minutes, thank you. And in fact, you know, they have to say, I have no idea. And you are helping somebody have your baby, not just have a baby. And these are the ads. Again, healthy, intelligent, and generous. We don't want stupid, unhealthy, ungenerous. And again, this ad is $150. So finally, just to bring it all around to the final aspect of the third party, the whole issue of surrogacy. Again, people always say, how do you find the people that you shoot in your films? I go, they find me. They're always emailing me. That's the power of the internet. And so we intentionally interviewed women in America who made the decision, or not to make the decision, you know, felt that they didn't make the decision, to be surrogates from all the different angles that we debated. So we have 2 categories. We have what's called the gestational surrogate, which she's just providing her uterus for 9 months. Rent a womb. And we have what they call the traditional surrogate, where she's also the genetic mother, so it's her egg and her womb, but she's entering into a contract when this child, my child, is born, I will give it away or sell it or, you know, hand it over to you. We interviewed women that did it for free, so truly altruistic surrogates. They didn't want to make money, they just wanted to help somebody who couldn't have a baby. Or they were doing it for the money. I need the money. And oh, by the way, I'm also helping somebody. We interviewed women on the screen that did it for friends, family. You know, it's just we have friends helping friends, family helping family. And for women who did it with strangers that they met on message boards, just posting an ad, I'm looking for somebody to do this. And so that's Tanya, Heather, Gail, and Cindy. Jessica's interesting because Jessica was born of surrogacy. And she's very outspoken and against it. And all of these women have joined our international campaign, Stop Surrogacy Now, and speak out regularly to the press and are very outraged and regret their decision to do this. And the women had serious medical risks, medical complications, all kinds of complex issues with family and the dynamics. Gail, who was a surrogate for her brother and his partner, they're a same-sex couple. I mean, they don't even speak to each other, and they share custody of the two little girls. She gave birth to twins that she delivered. And so it's very fracturing of families. And then the women on the bottom, Brittany Rose and Melissa on the bottom are the two women in California I mentioned earlier that were pregnant with triplets as surrogates who were asked to selectively reduce down the pregnancy, and that is them. And then in the middle is Brooke Brown. She actually died of surrogacy related complications, pregnancy this year in the U.S. She was a mother of 3 little boys, married. She had been a surrogate 5 times, so she'd given birth to 5 babies, or was going to give birth to 5 babies. She was pregnant with twins for a couple from Spain. This is illegal in Spain, so people come to the U.S. where anything goes. The day before she was scheduled for a normal cesarean section, she was term, everything was fine. She suffered from placental abruption, which is where the placenta just literally rips away from the wall of the uterus. And the only way these women don't die is if it happens literally and they're standing in the middle of an operating room where they can immediately open these people up and stop the bleeding. So she was at home, of course, and so she and the twins she was carrying died. So here we have a situation where Brooke obviously loved being a surrogate and helping people, but we have these 3 young boys and a husband who lost her. Not to mention the couple in Spain that really wanted children, lost the two little babies that she was caring for them. So again, the surrogate's an angel. Now, I got this so much today with the media, but what if she wants to help somebody? What if she wants to help somebody? The whole issue around regulation. The legal issues are rare, and as long as we have really good laws and contracts, we can protect all the stakeholders so people aren't harmed. I say to the lawmakers, I tell them the story of Brooke Brown who died and those babies who died. I said, tell me what law would have protected her. Tell me what kind of law what kind of regulation would have saved this woman and these 2 babies' lives. I don't. You can't make laws that get rid of medical risks and harms. It's easy for surrogates to detach from the children. That's not true. Maternal-child bonding is a good, natural, wonderful thing that normally we encourage as doctors and nurses. And as a pediatric nurse, we work like crazy to get moms and babies and dads and babies to attach early on. And in this area, doesn't make any difference. Don't get attached. You're not going to keep this baby. You're just the easy bake oven, baking a nice little loaf of bread that you're going to give away. And it does commercialize procreation. There's tons of money here. Money's all over driving this. We've seen what's happened in 3rd world countries where recently India has really tightened up their laws and said, no more. Nobody can come to India now and exploit a poor woman. The womb isn't arbitrary. I mean, as a pediatric nurse, there's one thing a newborn baby knows when they're born. Only one thing. They know their mother. They know her sound. They know her smell. They know her voice. They know her rhythm. They know their mothers. So to say that the womb is just this meaningless incubator does not bear out at all in any of the medical literature. And bonding is so good and so important. Surrogacy hurts women. These are some of the ads. I love this one. Lease your body. It's like a car. Lease your body. How do I get started making money? And again, a beacon of hope. She's a beacon of hope. My colleagues that work in the whole area of prostitution and sex trafficking, one of my colleagues has written this very provocative book called Surrogacy and Prostitution in the Split South. And she does a brilliant job of handling the prostitute is the dirty whore. Pardon my rough language. The prostitute is the person you don't bring home to mother. You don't want anybody to know you're with her. She's the dirty whore, but you want her body for sex. The surrogate is the Madonna. She's the angel. And you're not having sex with her, but she's producing this child for you in this magical, wonderful, way. And when in fact, we're just exploiting and using the body of the woman, her reproductive body, for our own gain, for our own needs and our own desires. And this is my final slide, but the whole area of tourism, which is why I'm here, which is why I go to Spain, which is why we started the Stop Surrogacy Now campaign, which actually even includes language about egg trafficking in that campaign document. I encourage you to go stopsurrogacynow.com and read the statement. If you agree, sign on. I'm sure the more people in Ireland can spread the word, the easier you'll have passing a good law or stopping surrogacy in Ireland, as the French have done, and as the Germans have done, and as the Swedes have done. And it is a form of human trafficking. If you look at the contracts that these women sign, if you look at the way, especially in third world countries, how they're treated, and they're basically indentured slaves for a 9-month period, if it smells and sounds like human trafficking, it must be. So I'm going to stop there, and I welcome your questions.